So we were just listening as you all joined to a little bit of Reena's beautiful string quartet Ragamala, which was one of the first pieces that I heard of yours, and we have been determined to program it ever since we first listened to it. We really fell in love with this piece. Can you tell us a little bit about the piece and your inspiration for it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. As you just started playing it, I was thinking about how it's almost 10 years old now. It was commissioned by Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival, and this was when I was a much younger person, so I was a fellow. And they bring these students in to kind of write for a string quartet. And I remember I wrote this piece. It was pretty soon after I had come back from India. So I spent a year abroad studying Indian classical music in Delhi and in various parts of India. And it was interesting because it had been after I had already had a master's degree in Western composition and learning to write, for all the things that composers do. And so I spent this year like really not writing much music and just studying Indian classical vocal music. And so, coming back into a Western setting, you suddenly realize how weird what you do is. And you're in when you haven't spoken English for a while and you start speaking it and you're like, weird words sound strange on my tongue. What is this? So that was kind of the experience I was having as I was writing this piece. So it was really just these four movements where at that point I was really starting to try to ask these questions of where do Hindustani classical music and Western classical music come together? What are the points of connection and resonance between them? And so that was what happened with that string quartet, which is now almost a decade old.
Wow. Well, we have so many questions for you along these lines. But I wanted to mention right off the bat that we were so inspired by your idea and interest in common ground and finding common ground in your heritage, and as you were saying, in your studies of Western classical music and Indian classical music and beyond in the community as well. And so that was that we've chosen the idea of common ground as sort of our theme for our season this summer, very much inspired by your doctoral dissertation.
I was gonna say, my doctoral dissertation is literally called that, so amazing.
We were inspired by that, and you've sought common ground in some really interesting ways, and I wonder if you would speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always thinking about that because, my background, I grew up in Los Angeles where I live now, but I grew up with parents who were immigrant parents. They're from the Indian diaspora, but even within that, my mom grew up in Kenya, my dad grew up in Pakistan. We spoke all these different languages. And so when you grow up in a household like that, you're just always aware that there are so many options and there's so many ways of seeing things. And so you can't necessarily see one person's way of doing things as right, because when your parents are so different from one another, and then your inside situation is so different than your outside circumstance, because as a kid growing up in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, I didn't really see my own culture reflected outside of my home. You're always just thinking like, oh, all these ways of being are so wonderful, and I wish that people could see each other's ways of being, because we can learn so much about expanding our own humanity. And so it's played out in so many ways in my music. I think the first one, which was kind of an obvious one, was that I went back to my own musical culture and tried to understand Indian classical music and found ways to bridge that with Western classical music. And there's so much further in depth we can go into that, which I'm sure we will during this conversation. But there are also other ways. So there's certainly places even within my own city where, as a musician, I think you have access to a lot of spaces. And so there was like one day where I found myself in, a multi-million-dollar mansion at a donor dinner. And then, the next day I found myself on Skid Row working with people who are experiencing homelessness. And you really see how humans are similar regardless of where they are. And I think as a composer, you are creating spaces, you're creating these ideas where you're asking people to interact with one another. So you can choose, okay, who's going to interact with one another. It doesn't just have to be a string quartet or a choir. It could be a a group of people who have never done music before and a group of professional people. It can be a group of people from different communities that are coming together. And when you can choose how people interact with one another from a mutual understanding of everyone's spaces, you can create these really beautiful things. And I think as a composer, we're trained to use what we know to find our way into new spaces. And it doesn't just have to be musical and sonic spaces, it can actually be like social spaces. So yeah.
Do you find, and for me also as a child of an immigrant family, um, so first of all, I think all of us, not just uh, first, second generation Americans, but all of us have to sort of craft our story of what is our identity. And it sounds like you, in the process of trying to build bridges to other communities, had to start from your own story. Is that a true observation?
Absolutely. And I think it's almost like the more you understand something else, the more whatever is in you comes out as a point of resonance to it, you know? And I mean, even, you know, for instance, like spending that year away from Western classical music, you know, because I mean, the thing is, I mean, you might ask yourself, like, how did I land up in Western classical music with parents who were from an immigrant family? My mother is from a part of India called Goa, which was colonized by Portugal. And so, of course, she grew up listening to Western classical music. And so when I started experiencing, you know, interest in music, she was immediately like, oh, like I should put her in piano lessons and violin lessons. And so it was really natural to my mother. But then what was really interesting is when I went to India and really started studying Indian classical music, I started asking myself these questions like, what is Western classical music? Like, I think I understand what Indian classical music is, but I mean, Western classical music is Bach, it's John Adams, it's John Cage. So I don't, it made me look and reflect on my own upbringing and experience in a way where when you're trying to even describe it to someone else, you know, sometimes you learn new things. So yeah, certainly it's like you're coming from your own experience. And also I think, you know, identity and all of that changes based on who you're having that identity to. You know, identity can also be a relationship, right? So it's like, I remember this really kind of funny side story. Whenever I was in a space typically, and, you know, whatever, before the internet and before you could Google image search people, you would be somewhere and you're trying to meet someone and you're trying to tell them what you look like. And so for me, any space I could possibly have been in my professional career, I could always be like, oh, I'm the Indian one. And immediately people would know, you know, how to find me. And so the first weekend I was in Delhi and I was at this little music club trying to ask some friends to find me. And I'm about to say, I'm the Indian one. And I just look at the room and think, who am I? What do I say? I don't know who I am. So, you know, yeah, you become different and different parts of your identity stick out based on who's around you, I think.
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, you referenced some of your work with the unhoused population, and I know you and VJ have this long relationship with Street Symphony, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the amazing work that you do to find common ground between people that maybe don't have a connection to Western music, you know, don't see it as part of their orbit, and yet it can be really healing.
Yeah, I mean, I started working with Street Symphony in I would say 2014, 2015. And so Street Symphony is an organization in Los Angeles that works with, you know, unhoused people, worked in jails and prisons for a while, even though, you know, with COVID that just hasn't been happening to the same extent. But it was a way to kind of, I mean, it started out just like, oh, we'll go to a place and we'll make music. But more than that, you start to see that the audiences are giving you something really different, because I think we all make these agreements when we understand what a classical music concert is, whether, you know, we've had the education or we've been raised going to concerts. We know, okay, we show up at this time, we sit quietly in the audience, we clap only at certain times, and however we might feel inside, there's a kind of a rigidity about the way that we behave in classical music concerts. And so sometimes, especially as a young performer or composer, you can feel a little bit like that response is a bit calcified and you don't know how to get around it. And you also don't know how to get feedback because you're not sure if you're really getting honest feedback from the room. And then you go into a place that doesn't know what those agreements are. And because of that, they have no choice but to respond in whatever way is authentic to them. And I think I just learned so much about the power of music to communicate. And, I'm still very much in touch with the people who I worked with in Skid Row. When I first went in, I just thought, again, the composer in me has this like anthropological mindset of like, I will just go in and observe and see what people are doing and then go home and think about it in my studio and write this piece. And that was not at all what happened. They were like, well, you're here. Who are you? Like, let's get to know you. Let's just sing with you. And I just think I had never been engaged and pulled in that way. And it occurred to me that for most of these people, and there's a choir on Skid Row called Urban Voices Project that now is, doing super well. And at that point, it was just a small choir. They met every Wednesday, they sang, and I would just go and spend time with them. And I just found that I learned so much about what music can do for people when they're not necessarily professional musicians, but when music is their lifeline. And so it makes you understand the importance of the work you do, because I think, in the pandemic, so many people were thinking to themselves, I'm a musician. This isn't saving lives. Why am I doing this? And then you see what music does for listeners and communities and people who just rely on it. And being a person who can create that music and create it specifically for the community is really interesting. And so it's like, again, as a composer, I'd be asking myself a question. If I'm asking people to sing who, you make an agreement with the choir where, okay, I need to attend this many rehearsals. I need to be able to read music. I need to be able to follow a conductor. Just because people can't do that, does that mean that they don't deserve to sing? No, it just means that you have to write a piece that allows for a certain interaction to happen and have an understanding of what it means for that to happen. And again, same thing with people who are Indian classical trained. They don't read music, but does that mean that they shouldn't be on the stage? No, it just means you have to think a little bit more broadly about what's going to make them feel comfortable. So I think, all of that taught me so much about the large picture of how are we interacting with one another? And I think that's actually helped my standard orchestral and chamber music as well, that's written for performers that do have all those things in place, because still we're all people and we all want to interact with each other in new and different ways. And so I think, just having that broader lens has helped me see so much about the world, but then also so much about how that applies in my music.
I feel like we're in a moment right now where people are increasingly interested, and certainly this is something Leo and I are really passionate about, finding ways to break down some of the formality and the kind of distance that I think sometimes classical music has represented or has meant for people.
It's an obstacle.
It is an obstacle.
It means that it's accessible to the people that know the rules.
Right.
Exactly.
And it's funny because I feel like, so many musicians, we give off a certain vibe when we're on stage in in our outfit, and the formality and the rules that are present in most classical concerts, and it gives an impression of us that I think is so completely opposite from how most musicians are. Mm-hmm. And so we've thought about this a lot with the festival and with other performances that we have about, why do we cling to this, the rules and the environment of it. And one of the things that we love to do with the festival is to try to make a more welcoming, more sort of human scale in terms of the intimacy of the concerts, but also just a more comfortable environment where there's more give and take. And I think as a performer, that's really exciting to feel people's energy and feel people included in the process. Yeah. And it's certainly rewarding whenever we can find opportunities to do that, whether we're teaching kids or performing. I I think we've done ourselves a disservice with all of the formality.
Cool. Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you in because it's interesting you mentioned kids because I also another one of the groups that I work with are between teachers and students, writing pieces that are meant for teachers and students. Because in a way, again, you can do a lot to change the dynamic there because students don't always understand what the agreements are, right? And of course, as students, all of us probably experience this thing where you learn, especially when you're studying with a private teacher, and it doesn't just have to be music, but almost anything. You're learning a subject from your teacher, but you're also learning how to be in the world from that person. And if you revere that person enough to, pick a career that they've chosen, you're going to try to model yourself after that. And so I think what we do with our young people and the way that we interact with them is really deeply important to how we land up in what our default is in the field. And one of my really favorite projects during the pandemic, I had like 1 month where I thought I was going to have a year-long sabbatical, and that did not happen, as I'm sure most of us did. But during that time, I just said to, I put a call out on Facebook. I was like, hey, I have a time to write a free piece for someone who wants a piece. And I got 51 requests in 12 hours and I had to shut the whole thing down. But then the piece I ended up choosing was a piece for two chamber musicians, violinist and violist, and their daughter who was 8 years old and was like on third grade Suzuki. And so how do you write a piece where okay, not only is she at this different level, but she has a certain dynamic with her parents, and so when do you give her the solo and make her parents follow her? When do you ask her to listen to her parents? I mean, and I'm not a parent myself, but I've seen enough dynamics between parents and their children to really be able to ask those questions, and so I just think we can do that, and it's so fascinating when we just work with people who don't know what the rules are, right?
Yeah. No, it creates a certain liberation for us from them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, one thing we want to play more of your music because we want to make sure everybody gets a little sneak peek. But one of the things that Leo and I were really fascinated to ask you about involves, so when you are listening to classical Indian music, the pacing, the scale is very different. The experience is very different than listening to most Western classical concerts. So could you first just talk a little bit about that difference in sort of the way that you listen or the way that you experience the two? And then as a composer that's integrating them, how you've navigated that. We have all kinds of questions about your notation, but also just how you go about sort of the process of listening is so different, and the scales feels to me very different, and how you approach integrating those things.
Yeah, it's a really good place to start with just how do they hit you differently. And I think, I mean, one of the things that I always appreciated about Indian classical music is, of course, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with listening to Western classical music in the sense that the longest thing you'd be listening to is a symphony that's, let's say, like half an hour to maybe an hour tops, but it's kind of on the shorter side, movements that are, between 8 to 15 minutes long tops. And a lot of times you're listening to something that's even as small as like 3 or 4 minutes. And there's a very tight turnaround. So you have to kind of get to the point very quickly and get through it and do something else and come back. And so in Indian classical music, you might be listening to someone render one rag for an hour. And a rag is it's like a scale, but it has so much more than a scale. It has all these kind of embedded melodies. It has ways of navigating it. It has like times of day that it's associated with. And so people have a much more kind of rich cultural sense of just what happens in between those notes than we do with necessarily major or minor. It's more dependent on the piece that we're writing. So of course, already, if you're an Indian classical musician or audience member listening to Indian classical music, you're going to know the minute someone's like, oh, we're in Rag Malhar. People are like, oh, this is the monsoon season. This is the Rag of that. And so people have all those associations already. And then you start listening. And what I love at the beginning is that they'll always kind of introduce each note in a slow, unmetered thing. So they're like, here's, it would be in Indian classical was like, here's A, here's B, and then we're going to surround it for you so you kind of know what its little world is, right? And so I kind of feel like things got explained to me through the music itself, and it felt really generous, you know, in a way that sometimes I show up to Western classical music and it's like I have to know so many things to even start listening to the beginning of this piece. So there's certainly that, and it starts very, very slow, sometimes way slower than our Western metronomes even go. And so it takes a long time to get that sense into your body. And then it keeps on going faster, 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 faster. And the rhythm is always very explicit. So there's always a percussion player, tabla, mridangam, based on what you're listening to, who's really giving you the beat. And so what that means is that the kind of the solo artist will go away from the beat as opposed to being a person who really defines the beat. So you're listening to something just completely different, and you're finding things in different places than you would be in Western classical music. And of course, it's interesting because when I answer the question the other way, Indian classical musicians are always like, there's no rhythm in your music. Like they can't hear rhythm in Western music because they're looking in a different place for it. And so it's really fascinating how different it is. And at the same time, there are these kind of basic building blocks that are just similar enough that there's some kind of basic shared knowledge. But what I love is the fact that because there's so much that's different, also bear in mind that Indian classical music is improvised. So someone's playing a piece of Western classical music, you will see them turn the pages and they're not going to play any note that's not written specifically on the page. Indian classical music is the opposite. Someone might have taught them a tune that's the equivalent of maybe like, say, 4 lines of music, and they are going to be improvising on that thing for an hour. So it's really like when you're listening to Indian classical music, you're listening to the possibilities they're showing you of this vast amount of possibilities that could happen and will probably never happen again in the same way. So yeah, it's because they don't quite overlap in so many ways. What's great is that you don't have to take out one part of one system and insert the other part. There's just things like harmony, counterpoint, stuff like that don't exist in Indian classical music in the same way. So you can actually put the Western stuff in there and it's not like stepping on the toes of the Indian stuff. And then even with melody, our melodies are much simpler. And so when you ornament it in an Indian classical style, it's not like you're taking out Western classical ornamentation, you're kind of just adding to it. So that's what I love about knowing the different styles and being able to bring them together.
I was hoping we might talk a little bit about the systems you've worked out for being able to put some of that down on paper.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, there needs to be, in Western traditions, we read everything and we have our sense of time, and in Indian traditions, there's improvisation. There's a strict sense of time that I think I'm only seeing from the outside, but it's I think viewed differently than the way we do. And I just want to screen share this a couple of pages out of one of your scores, if people don't mind.
You will see a thing that looks absolutely terrifying. I am even terrified by looking at my own scores.
Oops, wrong. Here we go. Can you all see this? Here's a page of Ragamala, which opens with a box. And followed by a solid black line.
It's got to be a way. I can't read that up there, so okay, there you go.
Is that Kirk?
Go over there, hit that. There.
Okay. So, and then followed by, some clearly ordered entrances from the other instruments, though not exactly metrically exact.
Right.
You're not controlling it in its time. You're sort of controlling it in its space and in its order. But and then as you said, maybe you said that counterpoint doesn't exist in Indian music, though. What I feel like you do in the second system here, the set of 4 lines at the bottom, it's instead of like what I would call Western counterpoint, it's more like layering.
Right. Right. Yeah.
which it provides a really interesting interplay the same way counterpoint would. It's just a little less controlled.
Exactly.
And then, so on the second page, we have more of this very specifically ordered entrances of the voices, though not exactly controlled in time, followed by this rehearsal C music, which, for those of you that read music, these are difficult times. We have 4/4, 5/16, 9/16, 11/16, and then
Don't forget about 15, 16.
there's 15,
16.
which makes perfect sense with the way this music flows in gestures and in groups, but not exactly in a groove. The way Josh and I played with Brian McKnight this afternoon, the R&B singer, with Boston Pops, and we played grooves all day, which was awesome. It was absolutely fantastic, and this is not that.
Right.
But I wanted to ask.
But with all of those time signatures, and you are very tightly controlling when we come together. So it's like there's those moments of freedom and layering, and then when things snap in for us to line up precisely. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think how you made those choices, and was that a process that took some experimentation from you after kind of studying both separately to figure out get them to.
I mean, yeah, you're asking so many great questions, and essentially it's like this notation system you're looking at, again, a score I wrote in 2013, and even 10 years later almost, I'm still asking myself these questions, because that bottom of the second system where it's these counterpoint, the kind of layered lines, right? What that line sounds like, when all of you are looking at it on the page, you're like, oh my gosh, what is this? Looks like so many notes, right? What it sounds like is right? And it seems like, oh, this is completely a normal thing. But when I would do this, right? So I would be asking myself, how do I even get this on the page? So what I would do is exactly that, right? I would just improvise and record myself, and then go in and try to give it a light meter, and then figure out, how do I just get the string players to play those notes, and then to have kind of a visual element where you see some notes are bigger than other notes, and so it's a sense of what are the notes that they're aiming for, what are the notes that are just ornamental notes. And in Western classical music, we have one kind of grace note, which is kind of a note that's before another note and is out of time. This is like layers and layers of grace notes, because almost everything, like even that phrase, again, I'll sing it for you. If you were to ask a Hindustani musician what they're thinking and everything else is improvised. So you have to find a way for a Western musician, through their own knowledge and training, to figure out what a through line is, what notes they're aiming for, and how to kind of ornament. And of course, I mean, all of that is like, with the very first recording I made of it, I literally went through with each musician from the string quartet and sang each line to them and had them play it back to me. So that's how we got to the point where one recording was made, and then almost everyone else who plays it has heard a recording of it before. But I think if I hadn't, say I had been a composer 100 years earlier, and I hadn't had the benefit of recording, I don't know how I would have explained what this music is. So I think even though it's through two very, very old cultures.
It is fascinating.
Oh, sorry, did someone say something? Okay, yeah. Through two very old cultures, you're kind of, it's only possible to connect them in a new space and with some new technology, because you can imagine that when people first listened to, or when the first quartet, which was not the one that made the first recording, when they first saw this piece, they were like, we don't know what this is, and they played it in a way that made literally no sense. So it's not everything is possible with notation, but it's almost like as if you singers sing in this thing called IPA, where it it's every possible phonetic sound, and they learn through that that system how to make the sounds of a different language with their voice. So essentially, that's kind of what I'm trying to do with Indian classical music. But I will also say that what you're seeing on that score there really only works in a chamber music setting. I can't have things be unmetered in a Western, an orchestral setting. And what's really interesting is, if any of you after this Google the piece, it's called Teenmurti, Teenmurti. This is the string orchestra version of that movement and some other movements from the string quartet, which is played widely. So then you're asking yourself, wait, you just said that this isn't possible in a large ensemble. How is this possible? It looks very, very different on the page to have a conductor be able to conduct it than to have the musicians have their own autonomy. But generally speaking, my most innovative work, I think, is my chamber music, because that's where I know I have players who I can work with and I can try things out with. And then once I know something works, that's when I'll actually put it into the settings for the larger ensembles. And that's how I experiment with my music. So I think my chamber music is always maybe a couple years ahead of where my orchestral and choral writing is.
And I would say, having played Teenmurti in its string orchestra version,
Yeah.
One of the things that makes it so successful is that it's really chamber music expanded. There are the sections that need to be just 4 players are just 4 players in order to make it work.
Yeah. And again, you're asking yourself those questions about, okay, I know how a string ensemble works. I know how cues are going to get given. I know what people are thinking. How can I use that knowledge to help people create this form? Because you can do almost anything if you understand how it works. Like, I always think about this example of, when you're knitting, you see so many different kinds of patterns. Right. I knew there were some knitters in here. And there are all these amazing kinds of patterns, right? And you think to yourself, how on earth do people think of these patterns? Well, there's a lot you can do if you understand the potential in the knit and purl stitches and the way that they associate with one another. And so for us, it's like, okay, we have so many notes, we have so many rhythmic options, we have so many ways that people run rehearsals. If we just understand all these options and understand the many, many, permutations of ways those things can work together, you can create crazy things and make people do things they never would have done before if you just understand the system well enough. And then in this case, it's understanding 2 musical systems well enough.
Should we listen to a little bit more?
Sure.
Since you were mentioning that just the sort of evolution over the last 10 years, we thought it would be nice to play some of Zaher, which is a more quartet that we will be performing the first week of the festival. And maybe before we launch into it, would you mind giving us a little introduction to that piece and your inspiration for that? We've heard a little bit of your sort of notes that you shared on your website about the piece, but I would love for people to hear a little bit about how you arrived at this.
Yeah, so this was basically the next piece I wrote for string quartet after the piece we just talked about. But it was many years later. It was probably like 6 or 7 years later. And it was a kind of a standalone piece, and Zaher means poison. And while I was writing this piece, and I think it's interesting because it came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, the album came out, and the piece was essentially about the fact that I had gotten a very bad case of strep to the point where I just couldn't speak and I could like barely even breathe. And of course, as a composer, you're writing through your own life experience. When you're experiencing something, I mean, that's what's on your mind and that's what you're writing about. And I was thinking about what it was like to just be, I was traveling, I was meeting a lot of new people. And what is it like when you're in a position where you want to get to know someone and you can't speak, like you literally can't get words out of your mouth and you're fighting with your own body. So that's what this piece is. And I think we'll probably listen to closer to the beginning of it. But at the end, what I have is there are these 2 melodies that are kind of washing over one another. The cello is kind of almost the poison, and the rest of the ensemble is just kind of trying to get it, trying to kind of neutralize it, right? And the cello is the one that's like super just like, bursting out of itself. And so at the end, finally, the rest of the ensemble kind of washes over and neutralizes it, but in a way where, again, the poison isn't the antagonist of the piece. The poison is just, someone kind of just fighting with their own demons. So yeah, that's a little bit about the piece.
Well, here is Brooklyn Ryder playing here. Had to let Colin get something in.
To stop that music midstream. One of the things that I'm really interested in that sort of goes back to our previous conversation is, when I think about a lot of Western classical music, so much of the control of the composer seems to be controlling tension and release and building towards goals that we all intuit. And I think as I listen to your music and to Indian classical music, that relationship is very different. It feels the way that you're controlling tension and the layering, all of that feels very different, but in similar ways also. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I think like within any rag, so this is in rag Tori, which is actually quite a dark rag. And so I mean again, so that you all know, I basically sang each of those things for the cellist and like sent him a recording, and that's that's why he's playing it that way, because on the page it's very hard to tell. And I think, you know, for me, my training on the Indian side is in Indian classical vocal music, and so of course, when I'm just improvising and when you're taught to improvise, you're taught to kind of take, first you learn, okay, these are the notes, this is how you navigate. And then you're taught to kind of take some larger paths that are like 3 or 4 phrases to kind of get back to something that feels like tension and release. Except the thing is, it's all melodic. And also, you know, because we have harmonic tension and release, and we know, okay, we're moving towards a certain thing, and then the chord resolves in a certain way. In their case, it's all melodic, and you can get into these very interesting places because the notes aren't just in a major or minor scale. Those tension and release patterns are in very different places. And so, I mean, one of the things about not Tori, but there's a rag that's somewhat similar to it called Kuriya Danashri, is that if you just take out the 1 and 5 of that rag, you will get something that sounds like a pentatonic scale, but it doesn't have the main 2 notes in it, right? So you can get into a weird place where you're like, am I in a completely different key? And you're not, you're still in that rag. And so, I mean, I remember once when I was younger going to a recital of this guy who basically stayed in that place where I thought I was in a different key for like 5 minutes. And I thought, wow, it's amazing to know that I'm not in this key and yet not be hearing 1 or 5, right? So you can just play with the tension and release patterns in different ways. And so a lot of times when I'm working in a rag, I'll listen to a lot of recordings of different artists and see how they deal with that melodic tension and release, and then try to kind of incorporate things into my own work that I feel like, ooh, that's an interesting phrase to kind of branch off on. So yeah, I do, you can tell, obviously it's a great question to ask about a piece like this, because it's there's so much tension, and then you're just holding there and you're like, okay, when is this thing going to end? When is this thing going to end? And on a Western sense, you can't be too predictable. So, but again, as a composer, when you're working through these things and you've listened to it over and over and over again, you start to second guess yourself, because once you know what you would do, you're like, is this still unpredictable for an audience, or is it just me? Am I in my head? You know, sometimes I make my husband listen to my music to be like, is this stupid? Is this predictable? And he's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. But you can't, it's hard when it's just you listening to your own work, you know?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to open up the conversation to all of you, and also make an introduction, because Reena, Megami Lewis is one of our musicians, our festival musicians. She's a violinist, and will be joining the week that you were there, and so happy to introduce you too.
I think
Awesome, nice to meet you. Yeah.
everybody is muted except us right now. So either unmute yourself if you want to talk, or raise your hand and we'll figure it out.
I see there was a question in the chat from, oh, it was from Megami. I love that question. Maybe can I start there, and then we can have other questions. Yeah, so she was saying, you know, I love your music. I really only know your string chamber music. Curious if you've written pieces where Western and Indian classical musicians who aren't experienced in the other tradition are performing together, and what that might be like. Yes, I have a ton of music for that, and it is super scary and like really fun, because of course, you know, you're right to ask this question, because when all the musicians are Western musicians, they all understand what each other are doing, but they're kind of entering a window into a new tradition together. So in that case, I guess I'm the de facto Hindustani musician, where I'm kind of explaining what the tradition is and, you know, introducing them to the other side. I have this one piece called Meri Sakhi Ki Awaaz, which is translated as My Sister's Voice. And it's a piece for 2 singers, a soprano, an Indian classical singer, and orchestra. But there's also a version of it for piano quintet, because it's hard to get an orchestra to, you know, if you're a Hindustani singer, you can't just hire an orchestra. So the piece has been kind of making the rounds and going around, and it's really fascinating, because in a way, I have to write the piece to make sense in two different cultures at the same time. So the Hindustani musician doesn't read music, she can't, and she's at the point now where she can follow a conductor, but she's not like marking beat patterns. She's just kind of looking for cues and things. And so you have to just see it through her eyes. Like, what does she think is going on? What is she hearing? What am I putting in the orchestra where she can understand, oh, I hear this, that means I need to do this. So, I mean, it's funny because there's a lot of kind of philosophical things like, oh, there are these rhythmic devices that you put in the orchestra where she'll know it's at a certain point I need to come in. But there's other things like, for instance, very high and low sounds are easy for someone to hear when they're on stage. So if you have a triangle ding, like one ding of a triangle, you can immediately pick that out of a texture, or one bass hits, you can completely pick that out. And so you wouldn't think you could hide little signals in there for the Indian classical musician. But what's really interesting is that in that case, she's paired with a Western classical singer. And the idea was that they would be buddies, right? They would actually be able to help one another on the stage. And that, the Indian singer wouldn't feel alone, but that the Western singer would also feel like she was engaging deeply with the other culture and not just being the purveyor for a culture that she doesn't necessarily know. And so, I mean, that piece has been kind of the emblem of a lot of the work I've done. But, again, I also have an oratorio for sitar, tabla, and then choir and orchestra where the first rehearsal of these things is always so terrifying because I'm the one who knows, oh, these musicians don't speak the same musical language and they're not gonna one of the best stories is Indian musicians don't read off parts in the sense that we're like, oh, we'll mail them the parts ahead of time and then they'll show up to the first rehearsal. That is not a thing. And so I always have to send out these parts saying, look, if these Indian musicians have not worked with Western musicians before, just bear in mind they're going to see this part and be like, okay, thank you, I'll come to the first rehearsal, end of story. And then they'll come to the first rehearsal thinking, okay, well, we're just gonna jam here and figure it out, and realize, oh no, this is not what I thought it was. And there's almost nothing you can do to convince an orchestra that a professional Hindustani musician is not going to come with their part learned, or to convince an Indian classical musician who's never worked with Western classical music that they have to kind of learn a thing in a very specific way that they wouldn't otherwise. So you're just there at the rehearsal process and you're like, okay, let's just see what happens. And you kind of figure it out in real time together. And so for me, it's very fun. Sometimes for different ensembles, it's anywhere from super exciting to train wreck, depending on what they know and how far they're willing to go. But you learn something very different about a musician. Someone might be like the best classical musician, but they might just be a little bit rigid, or they might really want to hold to certain values. And I think the greatest value is the value of flexibility and kind of openness and being able to hear things with new ears on both sides. So certainly that's one of my happy places, is working between those traditions for better or for worse.
Amazing. Thank you. And I love that you create this, relationship area, like you were saying, creating spaces between the two singers. That's so awesome.
Well, and what's amazing about it is the reason I wrote that piece was because one of my close collaborators is this Hindustani singer, and I just wanted her to make friends. And I was like, how can she make friends? I mean, so if I write a piece with her and a soprano, she's going to go to all these different cities. She's going to make friends with basically her Western counterpart. And it's true because now she's done it so many times. I mean, it's now gotten to the point where literally this week we are trying to find a roster of other singers who I might be able to train to handle it, because there's so many performances of this piece that this singer, I mean, she can't just make her entire life into going to city and sing this piece. So we're trying to get other people involved. But, she has made so many friends and great relationships because not only are people on the stage together, but they have to rely on one another to even perform the piece. And, that goes back to actually the very first line of that string quartet. You can't play my string quartet if you're not hearing and seeing what everyone else is doing. You can't just count the bars and play it. And I specifically wanted it that way because I wanted people to be able to listen to one another and interact with one another in a way where they were deeply dependent on one another. And I think that's just a thing that I want to put into our culture, that we are so dependent on one another, and we need to acknowledge that we're not just able to, have enough money or power or resources that we don't need other people. That's never the case. I mean, Amazon needs all of us, guys. So yeah.
as you were talking, it made me think a lot about traveling and what you learn when you're out of your comfort zone and in a place where the culture is different and you don't understand aspects. And not only what you learn about the other culture, but also just about yourself and that sort of feeling of discomfort, and what it exposes about yourself. And I feel like in a lot of ways, what you're asking of us classical musicians by translating and creating within this between these two traditions is a little bit like that. I mean, we're sort of traveling outside of our comfort zone to engage with this other tradition, this other way of listening, um, and making music that is not our own language. But it's
Yeah.
very exciting.
And that's so important because it's like you never, as a musician, if you've chosen a creative life, you never want to become calcified. You always want to be kind of thinking, how can I be in that space that's not, so uncomfortable that you hate it, but just uncomfortable enough where it allows you to see different things about yourself. And even for me, it allows me to see so much about musicians based on how they respond to things that they were not prepared for, and how they respond to even meeting people. Like, I mean, I had this one experience very recently where I wrote a violin concerto for Seattle Symphony, and an amazing, very famous Indian classical soloist named Kala Ramnath. And, again, she's the Joshua Bell of her field. And she came in and she didn't realize, like, oh, you don't, during orchestra rehearsals, every minute is like planned. You don't just kind of talk or whatever. So she just started, chatting up the conductor during the rehearsal. And you could see the conductor being like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? This person is so famous. I don't want to disrespect her, but I have to go on with this rehearsal. And it was just, I was just like, I just want to see what he does. I want to see how this all plays out, right? And he was so gracious, but he did find a way to kind of, rein the whole thing back in. And to me, it's like, that's when you learn things about people, where you're able, and where you learn things about yourself. Because even for me, I realized there are places in both Western and Hindustani classical music where I am deeply uncomfortable. And the thing is that I've just gotten really good at figuring out, okay, I'm uncomfortable. Why is this? Is there something I can learn here? Is there something I can do differently? Is there a question I can ask? And I think one of the things is it's just made me unafraid to ask stupid questions in any situation. And I ask, and it's really interesting because, I mean, I'm sure as all of you know, the moment you ask a question that you're like, this is so stupid, there's 10 other people who are like, I was wondering that exact thing. So yeah.
Well, speaking of potentially stupid questions, but one thing I've wondered is, so you had classical training in from very elite institutions. You went to Juilliard and Yale, and at what point did your interest in Indian classical music and incorporating that into your writing, at what point in your training did that happen, and were your teachers supportive of it? Did you have to forge your own path kind of outside of that tradition, or was it possible to merge it as you were training and as you were a student?
Yeah, it's such a good question and such an interesting answer. And I think, to be perfectly honest, I feel like the reason why I started looking into Indian classical music is because you can imagine if I'm I think I'm one of the only, South Asian people who's at kind of in the big orchestral and choral world in Western classical music right now. There's a lot who are in the next generation, but of my generation, I'm one of the only composers who's of my heritage. So you can imagine when I was young, people immediately looked at me and was like, oh, you're Indian. Do you do stuff with Indian classical music? And I would feel so guilty. I'm like, I'm just trying to write some music here. I can barely even notate something on the page. Do I have to just know a whole other tradition? And I felt just bad that I didn't. And then as I kind of started getting older, I realized that what was happening was that I the further I was getting into Western classical music, the more it was taking me away from any of my like family, community, people like that. And I just kind of played it out down the road. I'm like, what's going to happen when I'm 65 years old and I don't have anyone from my own culture, and I just have this life that is only kind of half of my life? And so then I thought, well, if I want something to happen, I'm going to have to make it happen. So on the side, while I was going to Juilliard and in my undergrad, on the side, I lived in New York, so I started meeting people who did Indian classical music, specifically because they were other Indian women who were musicians of my age. And so I didn't know anything about the kind of music they did. I just thought, we have a lot in common, and let me spend time with them. And so that's how I got led into the music itself, because they were like, hey, you do this, we do this, how do we work together? And those collaborations were ultimately what made me really interested in Indian classical music. So the point where it merged for me was, funnily, at Yale. Like, I was doing my master's at Yale, and they had hired a teacher, and it was a sub. It wasn't the main teacher who was teaching the Indian music class. They had that guy couldn't do it, so they got someone from New Delhi, to come over and teach the class. And this person had never studied Western classical music. So all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I was an Indian woman learning Indian classical music from another Indian woman, not going at all through the Western classical tradition. And the minute I saw that plumb line, I was like, oh, this is a whole other side of me. And then, immediately went and did the Fulbright. And what was fascinating from just a personal perspective is that, when you don't look like the kind of music you do, I think sometimes people can make all kinds of assumptions about you, and you don't realize what those assumptions are, because that's your life. And then all of a sudden you go into the kind of music that it is what you look like, so the stereotypes work the other way. And all these teachers who were amazing teachers were like, oh yeah, you seem like you should be able to learn this, here, just learn that. And all of a sudden I became a student who people expected to succeed. And so then I started to succeed, and I started to feel like, oh, I'm really being met here. And so then it was interesting, because I never wanted to let go of that feeling of like, oh, I'm doing the thing that, people really believe that I can do, and have a lot of faith that it's able to happen. And then I kind of brought that feeling back into Western classical music when I came back. And of course, what it meant is that, I had to stand up for a kind of music that at that time no one really knew or cared about. And of course, you can imagine, I'm at these big institutions, and people were telling me all kinds of things like, don't write an opera in Hindi, no one speaks Hindi, which a billion people speak Hindi literally. But it's like all these kinds of things at that time. But then and of course, as a young composer, you can get very dissuaded by people telling you that you're not doing the right thing. But on the other side, I knew I had an entire culture of people who really thought this other kind of music was very important. So again, you see these connections, and you're like, I know it's going to come together eventually. And there were certainly a couple teachers who did believe in me. But the funny thing was, when I was at Yale, I was in the School of Music. I was studying very serious orchestral composition. On the other side, I was running the Indian a cappella group. So there's all these kids who are like econ majors, engineering, pre-med, and they're all amazing Indian singers. And so I was the person who was conducting this a cappella group. And I would, walk around the campus and get recognized as the person who was conducting the a cappella group more than I would as a composer. And it's still funny, because they have these big Indian a cappella competitions every year, like these national competitions, and they still ask me to judge these competitions, because they're like a huge deal in this other world. And so for me, it's just really funny, because again, it's like you're perceived so differently based on who's perceiving you. And then it makes you say, okay, well, what community do I want to be in? And how can I create the music that resonates with that community? And so what I hope is that my music resonates both with the Indian classical and the Western classical community, and that, two people who might speak totally different musical languages are sitting next to one another in the audience, and then they can turn to one another and have a conversation about what they've heard, because they both heard something that makes sense to them in that music.
I think that's such a beautiful idea. And I know for me, I'm aware, after listening to you describe what you do and your sources of inspiration, that, I can't listen to a rag and know that it's about monsoon season. But I've experienced your music on such an emotional level, and it's spoken to me very deeply without those touch points, but there's something about the this humanity that you write in where, to me, there's much more in common than there is separation. And this, I think, goes to what I really believe in for classical music, also just music, really, that it's telling human stories. And I feel like composers share their most personal experiences through their music. And I mean, what a tremendous gift that we are able to find that common ground and to be able to experience something of what you and other composers experience. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that you put little black dots on a page and then we feel things. That's
I know it's amazing, right? Because I also think to myself, you know, it's like almost like once you get out of school, then the years seem like they go by and you're like, what was that year? What was I doing? But the minute I go back to my music, I remember exactly where I was. I remember exactly what I was doing. And so in a way, I have a very vivid sense memory of, you know, most of my life from the time I was a teenager, because I remember what that time was through music. And I think we imbue so much into the senses where a lot of times, I mean, even, you know, say for people who have experienced trauma, sometimes like just a aroma or something can just bring back a certain memory that the trauma has erased in their mind, you know. And I think there's so much in any kind of sensory experience that can do that. And so that's one of the things I love about being a musician, is we get a chance to kind of lock some memories in that aren't things that necessarily work when we talk about them in words or when we try to describe them, you know. Yeah.
we have a question, it looks like. Suvashini?
Yeah. Reena, I'm so glad to hear you speak. I've only had the experience of creating movement to Jula Jule. Yeah. And what you speak about in terms of that familiarity of being home, and then that stretching of how do I work with these new moments that you present, even in that piece. Yeah, your language really helps me understand all of that. And you know, I come from the tradition, if one is to call it that, and then, you know, and what I'm doing right now, but to understand more about how much you're building relationships between these two musical forms and humans is really lovely. So I just want to thank you for doing what you're doing, because I come from, I mean, I was born and raised in Singapore, so I feel like I live in that in between all the time. Yes. That you speak about, even though my family might be more homogenous, but that living part is like that, and how we have to explain ourselves and where we succeed and where we're seen as successful and where we're seen as what are you doing in this room? Right. And what you're doing with it is so fabulous. And for me to see how much you're bringing some form to the freedom from both Hindustani and I think Carnatic music, that it seems like you put both in. So thank you. And I'm, you know, I don't know how we might interact, but I'm looking forward to seeing you in Oregon when you show up.
I'm so happy to see you on the Zoom, because I recognized your name immediately, and I was like, I know she was involved with that project. I was trying to remember. That's so you were the one who did the dance to Jula Jula. That's amazing.
And I made the musician move. So, you know, it was choreographing, making the musician dance. It was fabulous. It was fabulous.
That's amazing. Well, and that's, I mean, that actually goes to show what is it like. I feel like this, having this career has brought me into contact with so many amazing people who work between cultures in really different ways. And it's like, you know, someone like Subhashini, who, you know, gets a musician to dance to Jula Jule, or even sometimes I meet people who, like, for instance, their partner is from India and they're not Indian, and they're like, oh, I really want to access that space because I know that they have this really deep culture that I'm trying to kind of find out how to understand better. And so I feel like it just opens me up to meeting so many unique and wonderful people through my work. So that's really exciting. Any other questions?
Well, we are so thrilled to have had this wonderful conversation, and we're so eager to have Reena join us in August. She will be with us for the second week of the festival, which the concerts are on August 13th and 14th, and those two performances will be at J. Christopher Winery. And there will be some really wonderful opportunities to meet and interact with Reena at those concerts. There will be dinners following each performance. If you are interested in joining for a dinner on that gorgeous J. Christopher Terrace afterwards. And we will be performing Reena's music on each of our performances. So there's at least one piece on each of the programs. And we're just so excited to be diving into your music and getting to know it, and thrilled that we will have you with us, and we can't wait to work with you on your music and to share it with all of you. So,
And if you come to the J. Christopher performances with Reena in person, you'll also get to hear new work.
yes, there's a new work for
Yes.
soprano, violin, and cello that we couldn't play for you because there is not yet a
Doesn't exist yet. And actually, open secret, this will actually be the world premiere of the piece, because the actual world premiere was postponed because of COVID. So it's a surprise for someone. So I won't say who it's a surprise for. It's no one on this call. But as long as that person doesn't realize the piece exists until September, we're good. So all of you will get to hear it before he will.
We're so delighted that we get to be part of that first performance. So that you don't want to miss that. That will be the second week of the festival, the 13th and 14th, and we will make sure that you guys keep getting information about all of these juicy details of the festival, and we look forward to seeing you. So we hope you'll tell your friends. We will also be continuing with this scorekeeping series. We will be sending out information about the next one. I think the next one we are going to dive into Beethoven Opus 59 number 3 string quartet, which is a juicy one. And we're just delighted to have you all part of our community, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thanks, everyone. This is so much fun. It was really nice to get to meet you on Zoom, and I hope I get to meet some of you in person in August. I'm really looking forward to it.
We look forward to it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.